Hello and welcome to the fourth of our webinar series. My name is Malini Mehra from Globe International. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Globe Parliamentarians at COP26 Webinar Series. This week we are with you live from COP26. You can see the globe behind me. This is the main action room, and I'm delighted to be joined by four guests. We have Cedric Frolick from the Parliament of South Africa, Senator Rosa Galvez, who is with us virtually. She's not able to join in person, but she's shared a message with us, which we will play shortly from the Parliament of Canada. We have Leo Horn from our partner organization, the World Resources Institute. And we're starting today, going directly to Jennifer Tollman from E3G, who's going to start with providing us an overview of where things are at COP26 right now. Where are some of the key things to watch out for in the coming days? So without further ado, and apologies to everyone for the late start, we had technical glitches, but my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Tollman from E3G. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Malini. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm going to give you a quick overview of where we are, the key things to look out for in week 2, and what we're really talking about in the end game. So we obviously came into this with a ton of momentum, both from a G20 text that talked about all G20 needing to review their 2030 ambition, which was very welcome given the significant emissions gap that we still face globally. And this was really consolidated on by leader statements in the first couple of days at COP. We saw a lot of leaders acknowledging the gap, acknowledging the need to do more, getting behind the UK presidency's framing of this being a COP that keeps 1.5 in reach, and backing this up to a certain extent by a series of sectoral announcements around shifting out of coal, really ending new coal, shifting out of international fossil fuel financing, a lot of new announcements also in the methane space, with a significant number of countries covering about, depending on numbers, 50 to 70% of methane emissions, signing up to reduce methane emissions by 30% out to 2030, a completely new pledge, as methane hadn't really been explicitly covered under the UNFCCC. But a lot of these things have been untethered from the actual negotiations process here at COP26. And one of the big questions that we have coming into week 2 is there an accountability mechanism for some of these sectoral deals? How may they be welcomed and recognized by the more formal processes going on here at COP26? In the more formal COP26 space, in the actual negotiations, so looking at COP as a negotiation space rather than a political space, we saw progress being made. We saw parties being very open with each other and actually managing to close some items, which is very good. But we did see some very problematic dynamics, particularly around transparency and human rights. And that is something that we're going to be keeping a very close eye on in week 2. We saw Saudi Arabia successfully remove a reference to human rights from the ACE dialogue, so the agenda items under action, empowerment, education, which was largely done because just not enough time had been spent on the item. We're obviously now on the watch for human rights not being similarly removed from important articles like the article around carbon markets, Article 6, and that is definitely going to be one of the big issues to keep an eye on, particularly as parliamentarians heading into the second week. The other big dynamic is that we've also seen a lot of divergence around transparency and how countries should be reporting to the UNFCCC. Under the Paris Agreement, all parties agreed that they wanted to work towards a common set of transparency standards so that everybody would be doing the same reporting. We would know exactly where we're at. And now we've seen parties, particularly Saudi Arabia, but also some of the like-minded group of countries, so including Brazil and others, really trying to push for that common reporting standard to happen as late as possible, and that being tied to a system of the reporting necessary around carbon markets. So there is a lot of risk around not achieving our high integrity outcome at this COP in vital issues like Article 6, the carbon markets, as well as in the transparency negotiations, and that is something that ministers have now been tasked to solve as we pivot from negotiators to ministers this week. The additional negotiating items that will be enjoying ministerial attention is the question of common timeframes. So this is very much about the runtime of NDCs. Do we have 5-year common runtimes, which would obviously be a very important signal on ambition, or does everybody just get to pick however long their NDC runs, however long their targets run? And that is incredibly important for the next ratchet under the Paris Agreement. So in 2025, all parties are meant to be coming back after the global stocktake to either define 2035 NDCs or 2040 NDCs. And you can imagine the ambition implications of this is immense. So this is an incredibly important part of the credibility and the kind of ambition baked into the Paris Agreement that we are going to be looking at. Alongside these mandated agenda items, which also include issues around finance, where we have seen clear divergences and a lot of work still needs to be done, particularly around finance for adaptation and what the forward path is there, and finance for loss and damage, which is a fairly kind of new topic enjoying political attention at this COP. We have some broader political issues, and I think the biggest one to maybe flag up here is around how we're going to signal acceleration at this COP. How is the final official outcome of this COP going to reflect the urgency communicated by world leaders in the first week of the COP and actually say we need to be doing more faster across mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and finance? Here we've seen the UK presidency come out with a first set of elements that do reflect the need for acceleration. This has been put to ministers to discuss, and all of this will be captured in the final 3 cover texts of the COP, which we expect on Friday night. So that is the cover text of the COP itself, the convention, the climate convention, the cover text of agreements under the Paris Agreement, the CMA is the technical term there, and the cover text under the Kyoto Protocol, which is still running, but that is probably not where you will see the majority of the acceleration. The big question on the mitigation side of things is, will countries be asked to come back to the mat and say how they are going to increase their action out to 2030, ideally increase their ambition, their 2030 target, ahead of the big global stocktake? So will there be a moment either at COP27 in Egypt, around the already announced UN Secretary General Summit in 2023, or as late as kind of the end of 2023, for countries to say how they're going to be doing more concretely? So really laying out that timeline for accelerating action. That is obviously very closely politically bound with the question about whether more finance will flow. Will rich countries overachieve, over-deliver the 100 billion? Right now we are projected to fall short in 2022, and it is unclear whether over the average of the 5-year period where the 100 billion was committed annually, so the 6-year period from 2020 to 2025, whether we will actually cumulatively deliver 600 billion. And obviously that money is essential to actually unlocking climate action, both on adaptation and on mitigation. So will there be a forward path that closes that gap, or will countries just acknowledge that the gap exists? And then very importantly, maybe a final piece to end on, a quick update, is the element of shifting the trillions. If we're actually going to set out a pathway for accelerating mitigation ambition, ask countries to come back to the mat in 2022 or 2023, the thing that needs to change is the access to the money that would actually allow them to do more, the access to the big trillions in infrastructure investment that would allow them to do more. A very good example of the mechanisms that you would need to actually do this is the South African deal that we saw announced together with the South African government last week, which was spearheaded in dialogue with the South African government by Germany, France, the UK, the US, and the European Commission, who are going to work together to crowd in trillions in investment to allow Africa to transition out of coal. We need similar shifting of the trillions to give other emerging economies, particularly the confidence to actually say that they can do more by 2030, and the investment in infrastructure to actually do more by 2030 rather than just promise more. And we saw first signs of this with particularly Italian Prime Minister Draghi talking about the need for a task force to make big development banks more fit for purpose in channeling and mobilizing the climate finance necessary to actually drive action and investment on the ground. We saw many other G7 leaders echoing this call. And obviously we would like to see that clear call on multilateral development banks to do more, to do better, reflected in the covered decision. I will end there. There are many other elements at play here. This is a very exciting COP, but a very high risk, high reward space. So there is a lot to keep an eye on heading into week 2, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much, Jennifer. And I know you've joined us at an exceptionally busy time. Like you say, there's a huge amount of stuff going on, but it's really helpful to have that top line of issues from you on the mandated agenda, progress on the sectoral issues, and the watch outs, really. So just to introduce you properly, Jennifer is Senior Policy Advisor at E3G's Berlin office, where she leads on E3G's work on European climate diplomacy. And as you can tell, very much steeped in the detail, in the weeds at this COP. So we can see if there are a few questions as the next speaker is talking. Jennifer, if you can just remain with us a couple of minutes. I don't see questions coming right now. So I'd like to ask our next, who is Leo Horn-Phathanothai from other partner organization, the World Resources Institute. And Leo is the head of the UK office of the World Resource Institute, where he also doubles as Director for Strategy and Development at WRI's Centre for Sustainable Cities. Leo had earlier worked as Climate Change and Environment Advisor for the African region at UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme. So Leo, you've been listening to Jennifer. What aspects of the COP so far, the negotiations, the issues on the table, the initiatives, would you like to emphasize from a WRI perspective? Over to you.
Thank you, Malini, and thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be joining this panel and discussing these issues with the Globe community. It's great to come after Jennifer, by the way, and thank you, Jennifer, for your tour de force panorama view of what's going on at COP. Maybe before diving into some of the issues that we're watching quite closely at COP, just to say a few words to put into context where we are. This has been a very a much hyped COP, and indeed it is a very important COP, but not quite the same from the last mega COP that we had, which was in Paris. Back in Paris, the outcome that we were looking for was a treaty that was agreed. And we're now kind of in the moment, bringing the proof in the pudding of whether that treaty is working. So there isn't a singular outcome of this COP, which we'll be able to determine success or failure on the basis of. And there's going to be a lot of differing perceptions, and to a greater degree, much greater degree than 5 years ago, the perception of it is going to be the reality of it coming out of the COP. So as an independent global research organization, we are very intent on taking a dispassionate view of, and we've been involved with the COP process from the very beginning. And so I just wanted to put into perspective where we are at now 5 years on from Paris. Coming in the run up to Paris, we were on track for 4 degrees of warming. This was what the scientists were telling us. Coming out of Paris with that treaty in place, we were looking at 3 degrees of warming. We're now within spitting distance of 2 degrees. And indeed, if you look at some of the analysis, the real-time analysis that has come out in the last couple of days, looking at the commitments, the sum total of commitments on the tables, the net zero pledges, the mid-century pledges, including India's recent announcement, we're actually on course for 1.9 degrees. And if you add on top of that, the methane pledge, which is very significant, we're looking at 1.8 degrees being within reach, on the assumption, of course, that all of these commitments are delivered on. And I also want to recall that the ambition at Paris was set at 2 degrees, or well below, but 2 degrees was the anchor point. And now we're firmly in a world where everybody there's universal commitment to 1.5 and a greater scientific understanding of why that 1.5 goal is so important as opposed to the 2 degrees. Also at Paris, there was a very lively debate still raging at the time about, development versus climate. Some of the big developing countries were still on the fence. We're in a very different place now. We're seeing that ambition, some of the most ambitious NDCs are actually being put on the table by the least developed countries. Gambia is really the wins the top stars for their NDC, and LDC coming forward with very ambitious commitments. So what we're seeing now is a real, the momentum that we're seeing going into this hype that we're observing is, in my view, proof in the pudding that the Paris Agreement is working. We're seeing the ratchet mechanism in operation, and we must remind ourselves that the Paris Agreement, these negotiations, the COP, the UNFCCC process, it's about providing us with the tools for effective collective action. The actual making of the cake has to be done by countries themselves and the actors, the parties, as well as the non-parties. So coming to the negotiations, I don't want to prejudge the outcome because we're still in the heat of it. And indeed, this week, things are heating up. There is still much to do, much to work through. And the process is a painstaking and grueling one. I really don't envy my colleagues and friends who are in the negotiation rooms. I am cautiously optimistic, that said. The key question I think that we need to bear in mind is for the outcome of the negotiation, and Jennifer has already touched on a lot of the detail under this, is whether the integrity and the ambition of the Paris Agreement will be maintained in its rules and implementations as they get hammered out and fine-tuned in the next few days. And the key points, again, to reiterate, because Jennifer has already touched on this, are transparency, the common timeframes that Jennifer mentioned around the next round of commitments, and also Article 6 on governing the carbon markets and carbon financing. So these are key areas to watch in terms of the negotiation. A lot also happening, and that's what I'm watching particularly closely also, is what's happening around the negotiations and as part of the Marrakesh partnership process, and what's happening from the non-state actors, the non-parties. And the three key benchmarks of success for COP that we share with the presidency are around ambition, so keeping 1.5 alive, will countries 2030 emissions cuts, and a process for accelerated commitments and action keep 1.5 alive. And we're looking there for not only what's in the NDCs, but what's happening in the real economy with countries and corporations and cities embarking on breakthrough revolutions to bring about systems change. So those kind of real economy initiatives are very important to look at when we're considering ambition. Secondly is adaptation. Really crucial to make progress on this issue. It was a little punted at Paris to, the wording was left very vague and to be worked out. So are we going to make progress on an adaptation goal? Will there be any movement on loss and damage? These are critical considerations. And there is a promising signal in the commitment. I think it was yesterday or the day before, from countries, from governments into the LDCF, the Least Development Country Fund, as well as Adaptation Fund. I think we saw 200, something in the order of $240, $230 million being put into that kitty. So that is very significant. The third major area, benchmark of success, is around finance. Very disappointing that we did not reach, that the rich countries did not come forward, did not meet the commitment to put 100 billion on the table for developing countries to help them adopt cleaner sources of energy, pursue nature-based solutions, adapt to climate impacts. But again, what's going to happen in the next few years is going to be critical in terms of rebuilding trust. Critical to all of this, I think. So, the three key things to watch: 1.5, the 100 billion, but underpinning all of this is rebuilding trust. And this, I think, is the most important thing that this COP can do, is to at least start the process of rebuilding that trust between countries, so that there can be confidence that collectively we can solve the great challenge of climate change. And trust is going to be rebuilt by putting front and center on the table what matters most for the least developing countries. So loss and damage, the things that I mentioned just now, adaptation, finance, really crucial that we make progress on all of this. And I think that we will have, coming out of this COP, some good elements to build on going into the next COP, and that there will be a credible narrative that can be made around Paris working. A lot of good things announced and pledged around methane, 100 countries on methane, 100 countries on forests. This was a big COP for nature, by the way. The GFANs, the financial commitment of $130 trillion in assets being committed to be aligned with 1.5 by mid-century. So a lot of initiatives came forward, a deluge of commitments, which we'll need to pick through in the after COP subsides, and we have a moment of calm to see if it all adds up, if there is integrity in the fine print, and if there are the mechanisms for tracking and following these commitments up. But overall, this, I would say, we see some very positive signals for ambition, a lot more to do on adaptation and on finance. And I think we have elements that we can build on, and as we look to the next COP, which will be in Africa. Thank you, Malini.
Thank you very much, Leo, and thank you for reminding us. There's a lot to do, but this has been a particularly good 10 days so far. It's Tuesday of the second week. There's been a flurry of announcements outside of the formal process itself. And we're delighted to hear from our next speaker. She won't be able to join us live. She had to rush off just prior to the meeting, but she was good enough to leave us with a video message. And of course, just to remind ourselves that over these 2 weeks, we've got ministers who are arriving this week, but we've had each day, other than the Leaders Summit Monday, Tuesday last week, themed around a particular issue. So today, Tuesday, we have 2 themes. The first focuses on gender and equality, women, gender and equality, and the second is around science and innovation. And our next speaker, Senator Rosa Galvez, combines both of those. She's a Canadian senator and also president of our partner organization, Parliamentarians, but she's also a former professor at Laval University, where her researchers have provided meaningful insights into solving environmental problems. And I'm delighted that we'll be able to show now the video message that she's recorded on her perspectives on the COP process, the negotiations, engagement so far. So over to Senator Rosa Galvez.
Good morning, dear colleagues. It is a pleasure to continue to share with you this space at COP26 and with all of those that are participating virtually as well. My name is Rosa Galvez and I'm Canadian Senator and the current President of the Parliamentarians Parliamentary Network on Climate Change. For those that might be unfamiliar, Parliamentarians is the institution that promotes dialogue and parliamentary diplomacy among the 35 parliaments of the Americas and the Caribbean, with a particular focus on open parliaments, gender equality, and climate change. Through our climate network and work program, we aim to provide parliamentarians with knowledge, resources, create a space to facilitate and exchange good practices, as well as promote an alignment with existing international frameworks that work to combat climate change and achieve a just and sustainable development. Today, in my function as the President of the Parliamentarians Network on Climate Change, I would like to present a new resource that Parliamentarians has developed to support our work as legislators, to develop, to implement, and monitor our country's environment climate objective, and ultimately hold governments accountable to the commitments made under the various international multilateral environmental agreements, such as, for example, the Paris Agreement. This resource maps the strategies and the plans adopted by the governments of the Americas and the Caribbean to address specific environmental and climate change topics. It aims to compile and systematize the information in one location to improve accessibility, as well as further familiarize us as parliamentarians with the action plans and initiatives being undertaken by the executive branches and identify progress and potential gaps. The following international commitments and good practice that are mapped include nationally determined contributions, long-term climate strategy, national adaptation plan, national biodiversity strategies and action plans, national action programs on combating desertification, roadmap or plan on circular economy, a plan to promote action for climate empowerment, a plan on gender and climate change, and ratification of the regional Escazú Agreement. This tool can be used in conjunction with a publication called Parliament and the Paris Agreement, jointly developed by Parliamentarians, Westminster Foundation for Democracy, Inter-Pares, and Globes, which is available in 3 languages and which offers actionable advice on how parliaments can support these plans and strategies, including providing examples and good practices and key guidance questions that parliamentarians can use to undertake their work. We therefore invite you to visit the Parliamentarians website to consult these 2 resources, as well as other valuable publications dedicated to support parliamentary endeavors. We aim to ensure that all resources are available, as I mentioned, in English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. We hope this resource also inspires our and other organizations and legislators in other regions to track these relevant plans and strategies. Thank you very much.
And I think that brings to an end the video recording, the message from Senator Rosa Galvez. And a great shame that she wasn't able to join us in person. It would have been excellent to hear of her personal reflections on discussions and initiatives so far here. But I'm delighted that we do have the Honourable Cedric from the South African Parliament, where he's the chairperson of the committees on ICT and oversight at the National Assembly of South Africa. And Cedric is also sorry, not sure if this is, the screen is just frozen. Hello? Hello, are we back live?
Yes, we can hear you, Malini.
Okay, fantastic. Sorry, my screen has just gone, has just frozen. So delighted that Cedric is joining us. Cedric is also a long-standing member of the Globe community. And Cedric, you've had some really of interest for South Africa, in particular the cola now, have broader. Over to you.
No, good afternoon, Melanie, and also to the other panelists and others that have joined us online. Thank you for the opportunity. Before I came to Glasgow, I had a very interesting discussion with a young person at the university. And when he heard that I'm coming to Glasgow, he asked me, what are you going to do there? And I said, no, we're going to the climate change conference as parliamentarians to firstly observe and also be part of the country delegation dealing with the climate change negotiations. He then said to me, but how many climate change conferences have you had already? I said, well, this is the 26th one. And he said, are you still talking about these things? When are you coming to some form of a solution? Because the future, also as President Obama said yesterday, belongs to the youth. If you forever postpone these discussions and never come to some form of commitment and agreement, it means we won't have an earth left that we will be able to live on. So you guys must wake up and you must now move into climate action and delivery on commitments and promises that has been made before. So parliamentarians play a very important role in overseeing these processes, especially where their governments are involved in the negotiations, because we are crucial in designing and adopting the necessary policies and laws, and also holding governments accountable, our own government that is, for delivering on the Paris agreements. And that is a role that all parliamentarians should play. And what has been heartening over the last few days here at COP is to see the number of parliamentarians who attended, especially the Globe Legislators Summit that took place, as well as the IPU meeting. But I still think there's more role and improvement for parliamentarians from countries to play and to be included in their country delegations. Parliamentarians will really get into the nuts and the bolts of discussions if they are part of the delegations of the country. Otherwise, they come to a climate change conference for a few days and they don't really know what happens behind the scenes. I am actually pleased to state in this forum that since our participation as parliamentarians in the climate change processes, we are now at the point where National Climate Change Bill has been introduced in Parliament to enhance our ability to implement the Paris Agreement and also to include the outcomes of COP26. And we expect legislatures to bear on their respective arms of government to deliver on the expectations. And coming to Glasgow, our expectations amongst others has been, and it has been said by Jennifer and also to Leo, is firstly to secure these new commitments of support by developed countries for the implementation by addressing both mitigation and adaptation, to complete the work on market approaches under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement by prioritizing and securing a share of proceeds for predictable financing for adaptation, to conclude the elaboration on common reporting formats and tables, as this will enhance transparency and understandability of the party contributions on mitigation, and enhancing mutual trust and predictability and making it easier to aggregate the collective impact against the global temperature goal. Also, importantly, to conclude consideration of the common timeframes for NDCs, which is equally essential for transparency, comparability, and the aggregation to assess the collective impact. Very importantly, to launch the work program on the operationalization of the global goal on adaptation, to provide clarity on and commence the process for determining a new and ambitious goal for long-term finance by increasing beyond the $100 billion per year from 2025, and also ensuring an adequate budget allocation for the Secretariat of the UNFCCC to enable it to discharge its mandates, especially adaptation activities under the Convention and its Paris Agreement. Now, these matters are under different stages of discussion. And one issue that as parliamentarians from South Africa we focus on, and we shared this also to the leader of the country delegation, the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, is the importance for adaptation to receive the just attention that it should get. One of the lows, of course, is that you find at these discussions that are taking place that there is still a lack of a clear commitment to phase out fossil fuels and coal by 2050 by some of the key developed countries in the world. There's a lack of clarity on outstanding financial commitments by developed countries on previous gatherings, where we feel that they simply don't walk the talk, or they don't put their money where their mouth is. It may be politically correct for world leaders to make certain statements, but ultimately it's about trust. And I just want to pause at the issue of trust, because Leo also mentioned the importance of establishing trust. We as developing countries come from a situation where we are still caught under the devastation that has been caused to our national budgets by the COVID-19 pandemic. And as South Africa, we decided, and we support the government's view, the president's view, that our recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic should be a green recovery. Because we believe out of all the calamities that occur and the crises that has confronted the world in the past, there's also an opportunity, and we see this opportunity. But once again, unfortunately, since the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, developed countries, they were saying a lot of things about assistance, aid that will come to developing countries, Africa, the issue of vaccinations, hoarding that has been taking place. And this has a negative impact on the relationship of trust. We expect the developed countries who have built their economies on coal and also on other types of practices that we now want to put aside, and justly so, we should do it, to walk the talk and to put their money where their mouth is. Therefore, we need to strike a correct balance between mitigation and adaptation. And one of the other things that legislatures as us would have expected by now is to get an update from the host country on the key elements of where there is currently no or little agreement on, and on the state of negotiations. On 2 occasions, we expected to receive such updates, but it unfortunately did not happen. What are the positives that we are taking out this far? There's clearly more, I think, directed discussions towards what the type of finance is required. What is the creative blend of finance that countries should receive in the form of either concessions, grants, and loans? But we must be mindful that we should not put countries that are already still struggling under the financial burden of COVID-19, not to put themselves further in debt by acquiring loans that is quite extravagant and that they will not be able to service. It will put them further into the debt trap. A welcoming development, of course, is the one, and that's one of the highlights of last week, was the financial commitment by some developed countries, United States, the UK, the EU Commission, and also Germany, in terms of funding. Clear proposal must be welcomed, and we need to broaden this to other countries, where they came and said to South Africa, listen here, we have seen what you are trying to do. We have read your intent in terms of the transition from coal into renewables. And this is what we can put on the table. But we as developing countries must also be mindful that we cannot always just wait for something to come our way. We must actually be well prepared in putting funding proposals forward. And in South Africa, the Presidential Climate Commission aims to build a social compact around a just climate transition. It is key in building a low carbon, climate resilient economy and society. And we need to ensure that during the process that we do this, we ensure that also that decent work for all, social inclusion and eradication of poverty is dealt with. Once the president established the commission and gave them their task, they came back and they said, government, this is what should be done. Please consider this. And they told us, and this is why we have no other choice but to engage in a transition, a just transition away from coal. The commission highlighted the risk for South Africa that our entire population face from a rapidly decarbonizing global economy. Many of South Africa's trading partners have adopted net zero targets, and it will be looking to lower their emissions and impose possibly trade barriers on emissions in intensive products. They also suggested that additional measures to lower emissions should be undertaken, such as the decommissioning of coal-fired power stations at the end of their commercial life, increasing renewable energy investment, and rolling out green transport initiatives. Setting more ambitious emissions targets will lower the transition risk, improve energy security, and attract additional international finance. It is thus noteworthy that when South Africa, the government finally then deposited the updated NDCs, we could see the clear increased ambition that is there. And in terms of the new NDCs, which is consistent with South Africa's fair share, and also an ambitious improvement on our current NDC target, if we go according to plan and we do receive the necessary financial and technical support, this would mean that South Africa aims to emit 28% less than what was proposed in the original NDC that was deposited 5 years ago, which is indeed significant considering our own national circumstances. We are further of the view that the implementation is key in building strong relationships between developed and developing countries, establish mutual trust, put transparency at the forefront, and also ensure that we are accountable for any assistance that we will receive. It thus came, as the President of South Africa, President Ramaphosa, said, a watershed moment last week when it was announced that the country will receive $8.5 billion to help end its reliance on coal in a deal that was announced at the Climate Summit. This offer is currently on the table for the country, and we as parliamentarians will have a keen interest and play an oversight role in to see what the elements of this agreement is in terms of concessions, loans, or other support that will be given. Currently, the country is a major emitter of greenhouse gases. We accept that as a result of the use of coal, which is used to generate electricity. This deal, funded by the wealthier nations, could have both global and local implications and will set a good standard and benchmark for assistance to other developing economies. In terms of current implementation, before I end off, what we in South Africa has done is, in terms of our approach, is not to wait on the international community and not to wait on the developed countries to make the commitments before we start moving with the implementation of what is in our national development plan and also in our green recovery plan. We have now started the processing of the National Climate Change Bill in Parliament, and parliamentarians will have to ensure that we pay attention to the detail and that it is in our national interest. The government is decommissioning 8 to 10 coal-fired power stations by 2030, and it also already started with the decommissioning of the Komati coal power station as a case study to implement the just transition to ensure nobody is left behind. The Lesotho Islands water scheme with its hydroelectricity component will play an increasing role in the energy mix in South Africa. And just last night at the South African Pavilion here in Glasgow, the Minister of the Environment, Forestry and Fisheries announced the implementation of a Northern Cape green hydrogen project with a local investor, Sasol, so that we can move and bring into the mix a green hydrogen project. This project, named Boegoebaai Green Hydro Project, is in the Namakwa Special Economic Zone in the Northern Cape, and we look forward to great interest to see how this will contribute our clear attempts and efforts towards a greener economy. Lastly, a number of new licenses have been awarded to independent power producers for each to generate up to 100 megawatts of energy and electricity for domestic consumption. So that is my take on it, Melanie. There is progress, but there's a lot of things that needs to be tied up in the last few weeks or days, my apologies, the last few days of negotiations that are taking place, and ministers will play a key role in determining the quality of the outcome of COP26. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Cedric, the Honourable Cedric Frolick MP from South Africa. Cedric, you've really laid out very comprehensively for us the work that has gone into the preparation for COP26 through the Presidential Commission, through Parliament, through governments in South Africa, and the results that you're beginning to see here. I think that the coal finance agreement has been widely acclaimed as a game changer because it reflects a new, more grown-up geopolitics where countries are realizing, I think especially as you emphasize the impact of COVID, the way in which they're facing a debt overhang. And the only way to get in front of that is by having a green and a just recovery from that. So new partnership around COVID and a new partnership around climate impacts. And as you mentioned, far more attention at this COP to adaptation and loss and damage in particular. So on that note, we have a couple of questions that really go to the heart of what's changed at this COP from Paris 6 years ago. And that fundamentally is around the geopolitics of it, the role of new sectoral commitments, the engagement in particular of private finance. So in our last few minutes, I'd like to raise for you and Leo. Unfortunately, we've lost Jennifer. She had to rush to another meeting. There are a couple of questions, and let me just read those out. The first one, and perhaps Leo, you want to take this, is how do you see Chinese delegation's performance at COP26? Is it to be measured by constructiveness, credibility, contributions, and ambitiousness of actions? And to Cedric, for yourself, how do you see the extent of the geopolitical changes at COP, in particular between the US and China? The G2, of course, there's been so much headlining of the tensions between the G2, but how does the world respond to it? What is the South African perspective on this emphasis on the rivalry between the G2? So if we can start with your thoughts on the question, Leo.
Sure, thanks, Malini. And Cedric, I want to congratulate you and South Africa on a significantly strengthened NDC and the great outcomes that you've were able to clinch at this COP. So China has put forward a, firstly, I think there's a lot of hype around or sensational headlines around the fact that the leader, Xi Jinping, is not in the COP. He actually hasn't traveled anywhere since the beginning of the pandemic. So I wouldn't overinterpret his absence at this COP as signaling, a deprioritization of climate on the political agenda from the Chinese side. It has and it remains very much on top of the political agenda. And that said, so China released a revised NDC on, I think it was right before the Leaders Summit. And it has some good things in it around peaking emissions before 2030. We would like to see more ambition than that, but that's what's in there currently. The objective to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Some goals on carbon efficiency of the economy, increasing forest cover, which is very significant, and also, I think, on renewable energy. All told, it represents a modest improvement over the country's previous plan under the Paris Agreement. And we believe our analysis actually shows that China plays an incredibly important role to close this gap between where we are and where we need to be to keep 1.5 alive. China has the potential to fill 1/4, 25% of the global gap, that gap between where we are and where we need to be. So all eyes are on China really to see more ambition coming forward in following this COP. And there are very good reasons, selfish reasons, that China should want to do so. Our analysis has shown that there is a significant economic opportunity to be had from moving boldly into a low carbon economy. Our analysis shows that there's over $500 billion, I think it's $530 billion in savings from reduced fuel cost, operation and maintenance of coal-fired power plants, etc. And that ambitious climate action actually leads to better, cleaner air that saves almost 2 million lives and generates almost $1 trillion in economic and social benefits by mid-century. So they're very compelling hard-nosed economic reasons for China to step up its ambition. And that is what we would like to see following this COP. And given our analysis, I think we have reason to be optimistic that China will, given the right geopolitical conditions, step up its ambition in a major way.
Thanks very much for that, Leo. Very clear and very to the point. I think that question about China has been answered really well. Of course, the G2 and the perception that there is a zero-sum competitive relationship between China and the US is dominating discussions here. From your perspective, as part of the key players in this multilateral decision-making process, Cedric, if you're still with us, would love to draw you out on what you make of the headlining of the G2 and, importantly, the role that countries like South Africa can play in changing the narrative.
Well, thank you, Malini, and thank you, Leo, for the kind words that you have spoken. South Africa believes in multilateralism. We do not believe that a new Cold War should be created between two dominant world powers, the one who is dominant and the other one that's emerging. South Africa and China has very good trade and diplomatic relations, and so do we have with all the other countries in the world. So it's only when people sit down and talk about things and see what's in the best interest, not necessarily of their own countries to secure dominance from the one side, but to look what's in the interest of humanity. We should rise above these petty differences that are there and the rhetoric, the talk that goes out, because it just contaminates the entire atmosphere under which negotiations are taking place. I am convinced, and I have visited China on numerous occasions previously, every time when we visit there, one issue that's on the agenda is climate change. And what can be done? What are the new technologies that they are developing? And quite interestingly, just before the COVID-19 pandemic started, I was in China, in Beijing, and the driver pointed to me and he said, "Can you see? It's for the first time in decades that we can see the blue sky again." That is because of the efforts that are taking place to deal with pollution in China. So I believe that both China and the US are critical players when we are in this type of discussions, but we must stop the war talk with one another and instead engage in what we have in common and rather forget about emphasizing those things that can possibly divide us. It's in the interest of all of us.
Thank you very much, Cedric. You've brought us very nicely to a close which emphasizes commonality and consensus. And I think your words also reflect the changing climate here that we're noticing at COP, a very different approach to engaging amongst each other and a lot more deal making going on. So I hope that we can report back on some really positive progress when we have this next webinar, which is next Tuesday, a week from now, and that will be after the conclusion of the COP. So there's a lot of work to do. So I wish you much power to your elbow, Cedric, going back into the delegation and engaging with the parliamentarians for an ambitious outcome in this Ambition and Delivery COP. And thank you so much to Leo, to Jennifer, and to Senator Galvez, who was not able to join us in person, but left some very important messages. Thank you once again, and have a very successful week, and we'll catch up with you next week. Thank you so much. Thank you all of those who joined us online so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye for now.